The ground shook beneath Tehran in the early hours of a Friday morning, and this time it was not an earthquake. The Israeli Defense Forces announced a sweeping new wave of airstrikes targeting the infrastructure of the Iranian regime across the capital city, with the announcement carried by the official Israeli Defense Forces Farsi language account and confirmed by Voice of America Persian Service. Surveillance footage from multiple neighborhoods captured the unmistakable flash of explosions cutting through the dark skyline, anti-aircraft fire streaking upward in desperate arcs, and the distant thunder of impacts rolling across the rooftops of a city that had been living under the shadow of this moment for months. This was not a limited symbolic strike. According to early reports emerging from regional correspondents and intelligence analysts monitoring the situation, the scale of this operation placed it in a category entirely different from anything seen in recent months. The question that every analyst, every diplomat, and every ordinary citizen watching from their screens is now asking is the same one: where does this end? To understand the full weight of what is happening, you have to step back and trace the arc of this conflict carefully, because what the world is witnessing is not a single event dropped into a vacuum. It is the latest and potentially most consequential chapter in a confrontation that has been building for years, accelerating through seasons of miscalculation, retaliation, and escalating red lines that each side has drawn and watched the other cross. Some analysts believe that the strikes announced this Friday represent a fundamental turning point, not simply another round in the ongoing cycle, but a deliberate strategic decision to target the regime's core infrastructure in ways that cannot be undone with a press conference or a ceasefire announcement. There are growing concerns among regional security experts that the threshold of restraint that had previously governed both sides may have been permanently altered by the events of recent weeks. What happens next may reshape the entire region. For context, the relationship between Israel and Iran has existed in a state of declared enmity since the Islamic Revolution of 1979, when Tehran's new theocratic government formally severed diplomatic ties and began openly supporting armed groups aligned against the Israeli state. But the dynamic that defines today's crisis has its more immediate roots in the past 2 years, during which both nations have engaged in an escalating shadow war that gradually stepped out of the shadows. Iranian-backed proxy forces in Lebanon, Gaza, Yemen, Syria, and Iraq provided Tehran with what its strategists called strategic depth: the ability to strike at Israel from multiple fronts without directly committing Iranian military assets, maintaining what analysts described as plausible deniability. Israeli intelligence and military planners, according to multiple sources familiar with their strategic assessments, concluded some time ago that this architecture of proxies and forward positions represented an existential threat that could not be managed indefinitely through deterrence alone. The logic driving Israeli decision-making appears to be rooted in a conviction that the window for preventing Iran from achieving both a robust nuclear capability and an entrenched regional military posture was closing faster than diplomacy could act. What the world is watching now is the result of that calculus. The strikes announced in the early morning hours targeted what the Israeli Defense Forces described as regime infrastructure across Tehran. That phrase, regime infrastructure, carries enormous analytical weight, and it is worth unpacking carefully because the choice of targets tells a story about strategic intent. In previous rounds of Israeli strikes on Iranian territory, the primary targets were military facilities, air defense systems, radar installations, and assets directly connected to Iran's missile program and unmanned aerial vehicle production. Those strikes, while significant, were calibrated to send a message while leaving the regime's core governmental and administrative apparatus intact. According to early reports from correspondents in the region and analysis from satellite imagery firms tracking activity over Tehran, the pattern of this latest wave may be different in a way that matters enormously. There are growing concerns that the targeting set has expanded to include facilities connected to command, control, and the regime's ability to project power internally. Some analysts believe this represents a deliberate signal that Israel is no longer limiting its campaign to Iran's military-industrial complex, but is instead beginning to apply pressure to the institutional foundations of the government itself. The timing of these strikes carries its own layer of significance that cannot be separated from the broader strategic context. The announcement came through official Israeli Defense Forces channels, including the Farsi language account, a detail that is itself a form of communication directed not merely at international audiences, but specifically at the Iranian population and the regime's own internal dynamics. There is speculation among regional analysts that this choice of communication channel, delivering the announcement directly in the language of the Iranian people, reflects an information operation dimension layered beneath the kinetic one. It raises an important question about who Israel believes its real audience is in this campaign, and whether the strategic objective extends beyond degrading military capacity to accelerating internal pressure on a government that has faced significant domestic unrest in recent years. The protests that shook Iran in 2022 and again in subsequent years demonstrated that the regime faces challenges from within its own borders that are entirely separate from external military pressure. Some analysts believe that Israeli and Western strategists are keenly aware of this vulnerability and factor it into their broader calculus. Air defense activity over Tehran was reported extensively through the night leading into the Friday morning announcement, which itself tells an important story. The fact that Iranian air defense systems were actively engaging suggests the strikes were not delivered in a single surprise wave, but rather involved sustained operations that required the defense apparatus to respond over an extended period. Reports indicate that multiple neighborhoods across the capital experienced the sounds and tremors associated with both incoming munitions and interceptor fire, meaning the operational envelope of this strike package was geographically broad. For a city of over 15 million people, the psychological weight of sustained overnight air defense activity and confirmed explosions carries consequences that extend far beyond the physical damage to any specific facility. There are growing concerns from humanitarian organizations monitoring the situation that civilian infrastructure may have been affected, though the Israeli Defense Forces have historically maintained that their targeting is directed exclusively at military and regime assets. Independent verification of claims from either side remains extremely difficult given the restrictions on press access inside Iran and the communications environment within the country. The regional reaction to these strikes will be watched with extraordinary attention in capitals from Washington to Riyadh to Ankara and beyond. The Gulf states, which have spent years developing complex hedging strategies designed to avoid taking sides too explicitly in the Israeli-Iranian confrontation, now find themselves in an increasingly uncomfortable position. Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates have significant security relationships with the United States, deep economic interests in regional stability, and their own historical grievances against Iranian regional policy, but they also cannot afford to be seen as endorsing a campaign that is striking a neighboring Muslim-majority country in ways that could inflame public opinion across the Arab world. Some analysts believe that the Gulf states' private assessments of these strikes may be far more favorable to Israeli objectives than their public statements would ever suggest, given their own concerns about Iranian influence in the nuclear program. But there is also genuine alarm in those capitals about where an unconstrained escalation leads, because the economic consequences of a region-wide conflict would not spare anyone. Russia and China's positions are equally worth examining carefully. Both nations have maintained relationships with Tehran that serve their strategic interests in ways that have complicated Western efforts to apply maximum pressure on the Iranian nuclear program and regional behavior. Russia, now deeply entangled in its own military campaign in Ukraine and in need of Iranian-manufactured drones and other military equipment, has a direct material interest in Iran's stability and continued capacity to produce and export weapons. China's interest is more economic and long-term, rooted in energy supply chains and the Belt and Road framework that envisions Iran as a significant node. Neither Moscow nor Beijing is likely to welcome developments that fundamentally destabilize the Iranian government or degrade its military and industrial capacity, and their responses in international forums and direct communications with Washington will be a critical signal of how much diplomatic and possibly material support Tehran can count on in the coming days and weeks. According to multiple sources tracking the diplomatic backchannels, there have been emergency communications at the highest levels among these powers in the hours following the announcement. The American position in this developing situation represents perhaps the most consequential variable in determining how far this escalation proceeds. The administration in Washington has consistently maintained a posture of strong support for Israel's right to self-defense, while simultaneously expressing concern about actions that could ignite a broader regional conflagration. That tension has never been entirely resolved, and the events unfolding in Tehran this Friday morning place it under maximum stress. Some analysts believe that the Israeli government would not have undertaken an operation of this scale without significant prior communication with American counterparts, even if formal approval or foreknowledge was officially denied. The United States Fifth Fleet operates extensively in the Persian Gulf and surrounding waters. American forces are stationed at dozens of bases throughout the Middle East, and any significant Iranian retaliatory action against Israeli or American assets would immediately draw Washington into a direct confrontation. It raises an important question about the degree to which the current American administration has privately accepted the logic of a more aggressive campaign against Iranian infrastructure, and whether there are understood parameters for how far Israeli operations can go before requiring a reassessment of the relationship. The Iranian government's response will be shaped by calculations of extraordinary complexity. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps and the supreme leadership face a situation in which absorbing repeated significant strikes without a meaningful response risks undermining the deterrence posture that is central to the regime's security doctrine and its domestic legitimacy. The narrative of resistance that sustains the Islamic Republic's ideological identity depends on the perception that the regime cannot be struck with impunity. At the same time, a major retaliatory strike against Israeli territory or against American assets in the region risks triggering a response of a scale and character that could genuinely threaten the regime's survival. This is the trap that the current campaign appears designed to construct, forcing Iranian decision-makers into a choice between two paths that each carry severe consequences. There is speculation among regional analysts that the Iranian leadership may attempt to respond through proxies rather than directly, but the Israeli and American ability to attribute proxy actions has improved dramatically in recent years, limiting the deniability that this approach has historically provided. The nuclear dimension of this crisis cannot be set aside in any serious analysis because it sits at the core of why the Israeli leadership ultimately concluded that a more aggressive posture was necessary. The Iranian nuclear program has advanced significantly in recent years, with international inspectors from the International Atomic Energy Agency reporting enrichment levels and stockpiles of enriched material that bring Tehran measurably closer to weapons-grade capability. The Israeli assessment, shared to varying degrees by Western intelligence agencies, has consistently held that the window for preventing an Iranian nuclear weapons capability through non-military means was closing. Some analysts believe that these strikes are partly aimed at nuclear-related infrastructure as well as other regime assets, though the Israeli Defense Forces have not confirmed specific targeting. If Iran's nuclear facilities are among the targets, the geopolitical implications multiply dramatically because the prospect of strikes on nuclear infrastructure raises concerns about radiological contamination and about whether such strikes might actually accelerate Iranian motivation to reach weapons threshold quickly. It raises an important question about whether degrading capacity in the short term creates greater danger in the longer term by hardening the Iranian leadership's conviction that only an actual nuclear deterrent can prevent regime change from the outside. What happens next may reshape the entire region, and several distinct scenarios present themselves for serious consideration as analysts attempt to map the possible trajectories of this crisis. The first scenario envisions a controlled escalation that remains bounded by tacit understandings between the major parties. Under this scenario, Israel conducts its campaign against specific target sets. Iran responds at levels calibrated not to trigger direct American military involvement, and the two sides eventually reach a point of mutual exhaustion or diplomatic off-ramp facilitated by intermediaries. Historical precedent from the shadow war of the past several years suggests that both sides have demonstrated some capacity for managing escalation even under severe pressure. Some analysts believe this remains the most likely trajectory, though they acknowledge that each new round of strikes tests the mechanisms of restraint in new ways. The second scenario is considerably more alarming and involves a significant Iranian retaliatory strike that goes beyond the calibrated responses of the past. Under this scenario, Tehran decides that the damage inflicted by the Israeli campaign is sufficiently severe to the regime's prestige and material capabilities that restraint is no longer viable. A major Iranian ballistic missile strike against Israeli population centers, or a coordinated series of attacks by aligned forces across multiple fronts, could trigger a response from both Israel and the United States that would constitute a genuine regional war. The consequences for global energy markets, for the millions of civilians in the affected countries, and for the entire architecture of regional security arrangements would be catastrophic and long-lasting. There are growing concerns among financial analysts that even the current level of uncertainty is beginning to be priced into energy markets and risk assessments for regional investments. The third scenario is perhaps the most speculative but cannot be dismissed. A collapse of internal cohesion within the Iranian system under the combined pressure of external military strikes, economic sanctions, and the accumulated grievances of a population that has endured decades of mismanagement and repression. Iranian society is not monolithic, and the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps and the supreme leadership do not speak for the full range of Iranian opinion or political ambition. There is speculation among some Iran specialists that sustained pressure of sufficient intensity could accelerate dynamics within the system that are already under enormous strain. If key figures within the security establishment or the clerical hierarchy concluded that the current leadership's strategic choices were leading the country toward catastrophe, the calculus of internal politics could shift in ways that are difficult to predict from the outside. Some analysts believe that Israeli and American strategists are not indifferent to this possibility and factor it into their assessment of the campaign's objectives. The human dimension of this crisis deserves prominent attention even as the geopolitical analysis proceeds, because it is easy to lose sight of the reality that Tehran is a city of millions of ordinary people who had no part in the decisions of their government and who are now living through the terror of overnight airstrikes and the uncertainty of what follows. Reports from individuals inside Iran, reaching international journalists through encrypted communications, describe a city where fear and confusion are widespread, where families are uncertain whether they should attempt to flee to relatives outside the capital or shelter in place, where pharmacies are reportedly experiencing surges of people seeking basic medical supplies, and where the power supply in certain districts has been disrupted. The human cost of this conflict, measured in trauma and displacement and the slow accumulation of grief, runs far deeper than any strategic assessment can capture. There are growing concerns from international humanitarian organizations about access to affected areas and about the ability of the civilian population to obtain necessities in the event that the conflict continues to intensify. The diplomatic space for de-escalation is narrowing with each passing hour, and the international community is working with urgency to identify pathways that could interrupt the cycle. The United Nations Security Council is expected to convene in an emergency session, though the practical effectiveness of that forum has been constrained by the divisions among its permanent members. Qatar, which has historically maintained communication channels with Iran and has played a mediating role in various regional crises, is reportedly engaged in urgent back-channel contacts. Turkey, which maintains relationships with multiple parties and has significant interests in regional stability, is also believed to be active diplomatically. European governments, which have invested years in the diplomatic architecture of the nuclear negotiations, are facing a moment in which the framework they built has been overtaken by military events on the ground. According to multiple sources familiar with the diplomatic landscape, there is a recognition in many capitals that the current crisis has a quality of momentum that makes it genuinely different from previous escalation cycles, and that the normal instruments of de-escalation may not be sufficient. What the world is watching in these early Friday morning hours is not simply another episode in a long-running conflict, though it is also that. It is a test of whether the international system has the capacity to manage a confrontation of this intensity between parties with deeply entrenched positions and powerful external backers, and whether the accumulated weight of historical grievance and genuine security anxiety can be navigated away from a catastrophe that no serious analyst wants, but that many are beginning to fear may be unavoidable. The Israeli Defense Forces have staked out a position through these strikes that carries enormous consequences for every scenario that follows. The Iranian regime's response will be one of the most consequential decisions made by any government in years. And the choices made by Washington, Moscow, Beijing, and the capitals of the Middle East in the hours and days ahead will determine whether this crisis finds a floor or whether it continues to fall toward outcomes that would be measured in devastation that lasts for generations. The biggest question remains unanswered, and it is the question that no intelligence assessment, no diplomatic cable, and no military briefing can resolve with certainty. At what point, if any, does each side decide that the cost of further escalation exceeds the cost of accepting a situation they consider deeply unsatisfactory? History offers examples in both directions of crises that found an off-ramp at the last possible moment and of crises that did not. The Iran-Israel confrontation, now entering this new and more dangerous phase, sits at a junction where the choices made in the next 72 hours will either demonstrate that the mechanisms of restraint still function under extreme pressure, or will demonstrate something far more troubling about the limits of deterrence and the fragility of the regional order. This is the story that will define the coming weeks. The world is watching, the stakes could not be higher, and the outcome remains genuinely uncertain.